The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute series of distinguished lectures of the American Bicentennial. To help celebrate the 200th anniversary of our nation, the AEI has gathered some of the nation's leading scholars and educators to share with us their views on the American Revolution and how it still affects us today. The Distinguished Lecture Series is a part of the AEI's continuing effort to open the major issues of our time to serious discussion from several points of view. The AEI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution located in Washington, D.C. Tonight's lecture takes place in one of the most historic locations in all America, the one-time capital of the colony of Virginia, colonial Williamsburg. Colonial Williamsburg is dedicated to keeping alive the arts and crafts and techniques employed by our ancestors in the 18th century. Groups such as these musicians, known as the Ars Colonia, are encouraged to share their antique artistry with Williamsburg's visitors. Colonial Williamsburg covers 173 acres in the heart of present-day Williamsburg, Virginia. The buildings are all restored or reconstructed on the basis of exacting research. Perhaps the most historic of all Williamsburg buildings is the old Capitol, reconstructed on the exact site and to the smallest detail of the original, which was burned down. It was here in the Capitol that men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Mason helped shape the foundations of our government. It was here that Patrick Henry spoke out so strongly against the Stamp Act that he was accused of treason to the crown. "If this be treason, make the most of it," Henry shouted to a shocked House of Burgesses. It was here also that George Mason issued Virginia's Declaration of Rights, which led directly to the Declaration of Independence. The Capitol was rebuilt in 1934, and the Virginia House and Senate still hold ceremonial sessions here. At that 1934 dedication, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. summed up the sentiment of the day, perhaps best of all. "What a temptation," said Rockefeller, "to sit in silence and let the past speak to us of those great patriots whose voices once resounded in these halls." Today, seldom a raised voice is heard in Williamsburg, except perhaps for a cry of joy when a visitor discovers some new insight into the beginnings of America, and the opportunities are many. Craftsmen dressed in authentic costumes demonstrate the techniques of their trade as practiced in the 18th century, while many of the arts of the period are becoming lost to progress. By continuing to practice these arts, the craftsmen of Williamsburg are keeping alive a major part of the American heritage. Such places as the barber shop, the milliner shop, the jewelry store, and a dozen other establishments stand on the original sites on which they were built in the early days of American history. In addition to the arts and crafts and tradespeople, there are over 200 rooms in Williamsburg furnished with American and English antiques. This is the kitchen of the Westland Tavern, exactly as it looked when the chef prepared supper for one of our founding fathers. The bedroom in the tavern looks today as it did to a weary traveler who may have spent the night in this very room over 200 years ago. Unlike today, however, it was rare for a bed to be used by just one person. At times, as many as 12 guests stayed the night in a room this size. Perhaps that was one of the reasons that many taverns of the day had such large and well-stocked tap rooms. Facing the Capitol building in Williamsburg, exactly a royal mile away, stands the Wren building of the College of William and Mary. The great hall of the Wren building is the site of tonight's lecture by G. Warren Nutter. Dr. Nutter will speak on freedom in a revolutionary economy. He is introduced by the president of William and Mary, Dr. Thomas A. Graves, Jr.
It is fitting that the lecture this evening in the Wren building, oldest academic building in continuous use in the United States, is sponsored by an association of graduate students in the college's School of Business Administration. The managers of American industry and commerce in the decades ahead must cope with complexities beyond the comprehension of senior executives of just a few decades ago, and light years beyond the dimensions of problems faced by their business counterparts 2 centuries before. One distinguished writer on management thought has called this the age of discontinuity, and well it may be. It is the responsibility of institutions such as the College of William and Mary to reduce, if possible, the personal shock of discontinuity by preparing its graduates to cope with change on an analytical and rational basis. How well this is done will be examined by those who follow us into the Wren Building's Great Hall on some future occasion. We are indeed fortunate to have with us this evening a distinguished gentleman who has had no difficulty in coping with change in his own life. Educator, author, government official, but above all, scholar in economics. Dr. G. Warren Nutter illustrates the scope of mind and flexibility of performance demanded of leaders in our own time. His current position as Paul Goodloe McIntire Professor of Economics at the University of Virginia was interrupted for 4 years by service as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Earlier, he had served with distinction on faculties at Lawrence College and at Yale University before coming to the University of Virginia in 1957. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. G. Warren Nutter, Freedom in a Revolutionary Economy.
Thank you very much, President Graves, Mr. Armstrong, distinguished guests. As I stand in these inspiring surroundings, I cannot help being haunted by a sense of reincarnation. The Nutters were early settlers on this continent. Among the Puritans arriving in Dover, New Hampshire on the second voyage of the Mayflower, the chronicles tell us, was one hate-evil Nutter, who, if he accomplished little else of note, at least left behind a name to be lived up to. About the same time, the 1630s, Christopher Nutter appeared in Jamestown to sire the Virginia branch of the family. No doubt there were Nutters in the environs of Williamsburg, plying their ordinary trades, when this renowned university was founded and this magnificent great hall was erected. Later, in the 1760s, Captain William Nutter led others in the family to the western frontiers of Virginia, where he built Nutter Fort in the neighborhood of what is now Clarksburg. So I have the feeling of returning in their behalf to an ancestral home. That was half my family. The other half, fleeing oppression in Eastern Europe late in the 19th century and traveling in steerage, immigrated into this land of promise through the teeming cosmopolitan centers of our republic. These two strains of sturdy and ordinary folk, from whom I have had the good fortune to be descended, differed greatly in origin, but they shared one thing in common: the will to seek freedom and opportunity. They found both in widely separated times and places within the same society. It is natural, then, that I reflect on this rich heritage as I speak tonight on freedom in a revolutionary economy. Times change. When my townsman, Thomas Jefferson, journeyed to Williamsburg in May 1779, hopefully not waiting too long in line to fill his horse, and shortly afterward took up residence in the palace as governor, Virginia was at war. Strange things were happening in the economy, and they were to become stranger over the ensuing 2 years of Jefferson's stewardship. Inflation was rampant, goods were requisitioned, property was impressed, salt rationed, hoarding declared a crime, and exports put under embargo. Short of arms, Virginia launched an abortive project to produce them in a state arsenal. If price and wage controls were not widely or vigorously applied, it was in spite of constant urgings by the desperate Continental Congress to do so. The lessons of experience were simply too compelling. Wherever and whenever tried in the new states fighting for independence, price and wage fixing had brought nothing but great economic mischief. As we assemble here today in Williamsburg on the eve of the bicentenary of our republic, we may be grateful for one important difference in the times. We are not now at war. In that respect, times have changed. This is not to say that the harsh measures resorted to in the Revolutionary War were normal for the colonial period as well. Quite the contrary. Under the British policy of salutary neglect, in force until 1763, the colonial economy had been largely spared the mercantilist imprint of the age. Plenty of good land and liberty to manage their own affairs, their own way, Adam Smith observed, seemed to be the two great causes of the prosperity of all new colonies. But why, he wondered, had progress been so much more rapid in the English colonies of North America than in other European colonies throughout the world? The answer was not to be found, he thought, in a richer or more abundant soil, but rather in institutions that enabled the English colonists to make better use of the plentiful resources at their disposal. These were first political. As Smith put it, in everything except their foreign trade, the liberty of the English colonists to manage their own affairs their own way is complete. It is in every respect equal to that of their fellow citizens at home, and is secured in the same manner by an assembly of the representatives of the people who claim the sole right of imposing taxes for the support of the colony government. But there was more. Plenty of good land meant not only abundant resources, but also, in a less literal sense, the elbow room needed by a new social order if it was to discard those vestigial institutions that had stifled progress for so long under the established order of things. A case in point was land tenure itself, which could be freed from the bonds of primogeniture and entail in the absence of an entrenched nobility or similar aristocracy. The new society could, when permitted by the mother country, strike out in new directions and prosper accordingly. The contribution of the mother country was, in Adam Smith's eyes, strictly that of a mother. In what way, therefore, has the policy of Europe contributed either to the first establishment or to the present grandeur of the colonies of America, he asked. In one way, and in one way only, it has contributed a good deal. Magna virum mater. It bred and formed the men who were capable of achieving such great actions and of laying the foundation of so great an empire. And there is no other quarter of the world of which the policy is capable of forming or has actually and in fact formed such men. The colonies owe to the policy of Europe the education and great views of their active and enterprising founders, and some of the greatest and most important of them as far as concern their internal government owe it to scarce anything else. The cultural flow did not, of course, cease with the founding of the colonies. The book from which I have quoted, The Wealth of Nations, was, for one thing, published the same year as the Declaration of Independence. And then there was James Watt's invention of the steam engine, scarcely a decade before. This remarkable confluence of ideas laid the foundation for a revolutionary society. All at once, it seems, there sprang forth this congenial triad, a novel concept of representative government, a science of economics, and an industrial technology, each revolutionary in its own right and exponentially so when combined together. These ideas had their proximate origin in two amazingly small circles of minds, one located in the incipient United States and the other in Scotland. Though no Virginian can gladly resist the temptation to do so, I will not dwell on the American circle, so well known to us as our founding fathers. And as far as the Scottish circle is concerned, the only point I wish to make here is that Smith and Watt were once colleagues at the University of Glasgow. John Ray, Smith's biographer, describes their relation in this way. There is nothing in the university minutes to connect Smith in any more special way than the other professors with the university's timely hospitality to James Watt. But as that act was a direct protest on behalf of industrial liberty against the tyrannical spirit of the trade guilds, so strongly condemned in The Wealth of Nations, it is at least interesting to remember that Smith had a part in it. Watt, it may be recollected, was then a lad of 20 who had come back from London to Glasgow to set up as mathematical instrument maker. But, though there was no other mathematical instrument maker in the city, the Corporation of Hammermen refused to permit his settlement because he was not the son or son-in-law of a burgess and had not served his apprenticeship to the craft within the burgh. But in those days of privilege, the universities also had their privileges. The professors of Glasgow enjoyed an absolute and independent authority over the area within college bounds, and they defeated the oppression of Watt by making him mathematical instrument maker to the university and giving him a room in the college buildings for his workshop and another at the college gates for the sale of his instruments. In these proceedings, Smith joined, we may be sure, with the warmest approval. Watt's workshop was a favorite resort of Smith's during his residence at Glasgow College, for Watt's conversation, young though he was fresh and original, and had great attractions for the stronger spirits about him. Watt, on his side, retained always the deepest respect for Smith. And when he was amusing the leisure of his old age in 1809 with his new invention of the sculpture machine and presenting his works to his friends as the productions of a young artist just entering his 83rd year, one of his first works he executed with the machine was a small head of Adam Smith in ivory. Respect for Smith was hardly confined to Watt or Scotland, for the wealth of nations migrated easily and widely abroad, finding an eager audience in many parts and certainly on our shores. Our founders were familiar with this great work in one way or another, some more than others. Alexander Hamilton, Tench Coxe, or whoever wrote the renowned report on manufactures, paraphrased Smith at length and quoted him verbatim at one point, though without acknowledging the source. Deliberations at the Constitutional Convention revealed a much wider group acquainted with the emerging science of economics. Passage of time has caused differing verdicts to be rendered on the originality, rigor, and consistency of Smith's masterpiece, but history leaves no doubt about its massive impact and significance. Its genius derived from the molding together of fragments of evolving economic thought into a synthetic whole, masterfully applied to familiar situations in a way that revealed a coherent system for organizing social activity not easily envisaged before and destined to capture the imagination of thoughtful leaders ready to grasp revolutionary ideas. It, like the Declaration and the ensuing Constitution, struck a spark in receptive tinder. Social thought was not to be the same afterward as before. Ideas do have consequences, dependent on the historical conjuncture into which they are thrust, and this was a propitious time for exciting ideas.
Dr. G. Warren Nutter has been discussing the role played by economic philosophy in the development of the American system in the Revolutionary period. In just one moment, he will continue his lecture. The magnificent brick Governor's Palace was one of the first major buildings built in colonial Williamsburg. The building has been a silent witness to some great moments in history, but perhaps one of the most bizarre scenes to be played out just beyond its walls occurred in 1718, shortly before the palace was finally complete. The surviving members of the crew of Blackbeard the pirate were brought to Williamsburg after their capture, and one by one they were hanged here in punishment for their crimes on the high seas. At the time of the hangings, the Virginia General Assembly was meeting in the large building designed by Christopher Wren for the College of William and Mary. Inside that building today, Dr. G. Warren Nutter is continuing his lecture on freedom in a revolutionary economy.
Those who easily discern a simple order in history, an uncomplicated nexus of cause and consequence, may single out one or another factor as the dominant force shaping the course of events in those times, but not I. Such sweeping interpretations of history obscure more than they reveal. Opportunities and constraints are the stuff of history, together with chance, reflective thought, and choice. And none of these elements flows mechanically or predictably from the nature of man, custom, institutions, or any other readily identifiable single source. History is instead the product of all these interacting forces mutually influencing each other. My only object, then, is to give revolutionary ideas and sober reflection their due in this singular epoch. When the delegates assembled for the Constitutional Convention, there was good reason in circumstances of the time for their attention to be drawn to the related issues of strengthening government at the national level and of regulating commerce, a term that had roughly the same meaning then as economic policy has today. Prosperity had not spontaneously emerged in the wake of independence, contrary to great expectations before the fact. Instead of prosperity, there was depression, aggravated in no small measure by the confused and confounded government of the Confederation. Experience in dealing with these troubles was modest from all points of view. Influential leaders were in their 30s. Conscious economic policy on the part of government, in London as well as at home, had a history of scarcely more than a score of years, and precedents for the envisaged new order were lacking altogether. Imagination and vision were bound to assume commanding importance. Wherever and however they acquired their economic vision, the makers of the Constitution deliberately gave wide berth to the economy of the nation being formed, reserving only a restrained guiding hand for government. In saying this, I am mindful of the persistent controversy over how much power the prevailing Constitution makers intended to bestow upon the government of the Union. On this score, however, I find quite persuasive the case made by William Gramp, eminent historian of economic liberalism. Concentrating on the 11th hour efforts at the convention to expand the economic role of the federal government, Gramp notes that what is interesting is that the proposals, all of them controversial, almost provocative, should have been made only a few days before the convention adjourned, when unanimity was urgently needed and when many delegates were trying heroically to find compromises that would produce it. Proposals such as that made by Madison to empower the federal government to charter corporations had been made earlier in the convention. That they were made again so near the time of adjournment suggests that their advocates were making a last great effort to write broad economic powers into the Constitution. Perhaps they prevailed upon Franklin in the belief that his great authority would be decisive, but they were defeated. The very extensive powers proposed by Randolph, Morris, Franklin, Hamilton, and Madison were reduced to the limited provisions of Section 8 of Article 1, which include the power to tax, borrow, regulate commerce, pass uniform bankruptcy laws, coin money, establish post offices and post roads, and grant patents. The limits thus established take on significance when compared with the traditional economic powers of the age, which, as Gramp observes, can be deduced from the controls which the governments of France and England exercised or tried to exercise during the period of mercantilism from the 16th to the middle of the 18th century. The fixing of prices, wages, and interest rates, prohibitions of forestalling and engrossing, regulating the quality of goods, licensing of labor, programs to increase the population, sumptuary control, monopoly grants and other exclusive rights, incorporation, state enterprise, and the control of foreign trade and finance, including the protection of domestic industries. The convention considered only 4: monopoly and other exclusive rights, control of foreign trade, state enterprise, and sumptuary control. The last 2 were rejected. The granting of monopoly rights was restricted to patents and copyrights. The control over foreign trade was left in an ambiguous state, except for the prohibition of export taxes. Although not made explicit, the Constitution allowed some power to increase the population because the federal government could offer free land as an inducement to immigration. Good often issues more from powers denied to government than from those granted, and this was surely the case as far as economic development over our republic's first century is concerned. None of the prohibitory provisions of the Constitution was to take on greater significance than the one forbidding individual states to erect barriers to commerce among themselves. Making trade free within an internal market that was to expand to vast proportions permitted the economy to indulge, for example, in recurrently restrictive tariffs, as the politics of a good century and a half seemed to dictate, without serious hindrance to economic progress. Individualism is perhaps the term that best captures the essential spirit of the time and at once implies the complex of derivative values. Liberty for the citizen, which is to say, the person deemed competent and responsible, liberty to make his own decisions. Power for the citizen, mainly in the form of private property, to realize his potential. Humanitarian concern for the less fortunate and incompetent, and equality of all citizens before the law and of the electorate within the polity. If the thinker turned statesman had his moment at the founding of the Republic, it was to be the practitioner, pure and simple, the doer, the man of action, who was to dominate the scene for at least the next century, when pragmatism became America's watchword. The individualistic spirit found expression in the world of affairs, not in philosophic reflection. As each was swept up in the excitement of his workaday world, his farm or business, his trade or profession, his public or private life. The nation, it would seem, was too busy enjoying the fruits of progress to ponder its causes, and theory emerged from practice. Political thought issued from practicing politicians, and economic thought, interestingly, from practicing jurists. Economists, such as there were either special pleaders or academic amateurs. In his classic essay on early American economic thought, the late Frank Fetter wondered why the fertile and original conceptions, which sprang, as it were, spontaneously from the new environment in America, did not come to fruition in a constructive and more lasting system of American economic thought. He found much of the answer to lie in partisanship, which blocks the path of disinterested scientific effort whenever personal prejudices and pecuniary or class interests are affected by the application of any kind of theory to practical problems. The consequence, and in turn reinforcing cause, was lack of a learned profession of economics. As Fetter observes, it is a remarkable fact that during the whole period before 1870, there was not a single so-called political economist who had received the minimum amount of special training demanded today for the practice of law or of medicine or for the pursuit of the natural sciences. All were trained primarily in some other field: theology, moral philosophy, literature, languages, law, practical politics, journalism, business, or some branch of natural science. In political economy, they were all self-trained amateurs who, as it were, happened to wander into this field. If the study of the more exact sciences were pursued only by men with such dominant motives and such unspecialized training, little scientific progress could be expected. I leave it to others to judge whether the absence of trained economists made us better or worse off in this first century of sweeping economic development. However that may be, the fact is that there was no body of qualified scholars skilled in critical thought to observe the unfolding economy, issue commentary, formulate general principles, apply them to problems of the time, and advise on policy. Instead, it was the law, issuing from acts and cases, that was to shape a framework for the economy, articulate its principles, and guide policy.
Dr. G. Warren Nutter has been discussing the fact that the framework for America's economy was shaped in the early 1800s, despite the fact that there was no body of trained economists to guide and shape our economic policies. In just one moment, Dr. Nutter will continue. Williamsburg became the capital of Virginia in 1699, after the original capital, Jamestown, burned down. In 1780, the capital was moved from Williamsburg to Richmond in order to escape the advancing British Army. Soon Williamsburg went into a decline, and it became a decaying ghost town for almost a century and a half. Then in 1926, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. decided to support and finance the town's restoration. Williamsburg is now one of America's most important national shrines. It has been visited by every president since Franklin Roosevelt and by such foreign dignitaries as Winston Churchill and Queen Elizabeth II. Today's distinguished visitor is Dr. G. Warren Nutter, who is discussing freedom in a revolutionary economy.
The spirit of the time may be fairly interpreted as enthusiasm for venture, viewed as the source of prosperity and progress. Consequently, the law leaned over backward, not to hinder the entrepreneur, not to hold him unduly responsible for incidental harm flowing from venturesome activity. It was as if nothing ventured, nothing gained had become the literal creed of the age. For as Hearst points out, the insistence on a showing of criminal intention in any case involving liability amounted in effect to a presumption in favor of the independence of individual action. The middle 19th century rationale of the law of negligence in tort reflected the same basic value judgment. Expansion of economic energies brought men into closer, more continuous relations in situations increasingly likely to yield harm. Nonetheless, at first the law emphasized the social desirability of free individual action and decision. Liability in tort should normally rest on a showing of fault on the actor's part. Action at one's peril was the exception. Hence, the burden lay on the injured person to show reason why the law should intrude its force to shift some of the burden of loss onto the one who caused injury. This attitude no doubt appears strange to a generation accustomed to the rhetoric of Ralph Nader and the Sierra Club. I have dwelt on these legal presumptions of the last century, neither to extol nor to disparage them, but to stress their importance as a manifestation of the social ethic of the time. Who is to bear the burden of proving what and why? The presumptive answers given to these questions say more about a society's conception of the good life than any list of good intentions, no matter how long. In the matter-of-fact world of our first century, freedom took on concrete meaning in the marketplace, and it worked. A continent was settled, a nation built, and prosperity persistently augmented. Now, grandeur was to take the center of the stage. It's neither my bent nor purpose to prolong this historical narrative, for the moment will shortly be upon me for a summing up, and there's more interpretive ground yet to be covered. Suffice it to say that our first century laid the basis for the second, still fresh in memory. We gradually moved toward a turning point similar to the one faced earlier in England. As Winston Churchill was to write at the turn of the 20th century, the great victories had been won. All sorts of lumbering tyrannies had been toppled over. Authority was everywhere broken. Slaves were free, conscience was free, trade was free, but hunger and squalor and cold were also free, and the people demanded something more than liberty. How to fill the void was the riddle that split the Liberal Party. Changing opinion ultimately brought forth a second revolution, a revolution in social thought born of economic crisis some 20 years ago. In the formative years, we seemed determined to make up for lost time in the realm of social philosophizing. The vanguard of social reformers comprised a multiplying band of intellectuals, spawned by affluence, emboldened by their own peculiar sense of superiority, motivated by the animus of the onlooking outsider, and hence, as Schumpeter perceived, inherently inclined to become angry social critics by profession. Learned economists, conspicuously absent during our first century, appeared in abundance and assumed a role of growing importance. To be sure, ardent defenders of the free society were to be found in the intellectual ranks, particularly among economists, but they were vastly overshadowed by the critics in due course. The way was prepared for the sharp inversion of social values that has taken place over the last generation, an inversion that has materialized in the form of colossal government, as the share of the nation's net product passing through the hands of government has risen from less than a sixth to more than 2/5. Security, protection, comfort, equality all seem to have advanced in the scale of importance above self-reliance and freedom. The fundamental transformation has occurred in the prevailing conception of the good society.
Dr. G. Warren Nutter has been discussing the development of the United States since the period of the Revolution. In just a moment, he will examine how economic principles are affecting the America of today. The College of William and Mary, the locale of our lecture, has long been associated with some of the great names in American history. Among its alumni are Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and John Marshall. 4 of the first 10 presidents were associated in some way with William and Mary, including George Washington, who was chancellor for 11 years. Our speaker at William Mary today is Dr. G. Warren Nutter, who is concluding his lecture on freedom in a revolutionary economy.
If social change is to move in the right direction, in accord with the standards of the civilized world, there must be those who stir and prod, who keep the public alert to inequities, who find fault with the established ways of maintaining social order. It is natural to point the finger of blame at the existing system and to seek salvation in its opposite. But therein also lies the great danger of our day. Those who protest against the failures of the market, real and imagined, too often see their remedy in turning affairs over to government, in expanding the political order and contracting the economic, relying more on coercion and less on mutual consent. The danger we run in looking first to government to solve problems is that progress will grind to a halt, that discontent will vanquish progress and the race will be over. Over the ages, the bane of progress has been too much government, not too little. Over most of our history, the question of what middle ground was to be occupied by our society between the poles of anarchy and despotism was resolved by the presumption that matters are best left to individual choice and mutual consent unless the contrary is proved beyond reasonable doubt. The burden of proof was upon him who maintained that a task entrusted to the market could be better performed by transferring it to the government. The state had its work cut out for itself, but classical liberalism implied a certain ordering of tasks to guide the emphasis of governmental activity. First, the state had to provide the necessary political and legal framework for the market by maintaining order, defining property, preventing fraud, enforcing contracts, and assigning responsibility. Second, it should disperse power by diminishing inequality of income and opportunity and by inhibiting monopolization. Third, it was to perform desirable functions too costly for individuals or voluntary associations, such as establishment of a sound monetary system, maintenance of public health, and promotion of safety. Fourth, it needed to help the poor and unfortunate and to act as guardian for the incompetent, protecting those who could not cope with the normal responsibilities of life. Fifth, it should stabilize general economic conditions. And sixth and finally, it should provide welfare services to the public in the form of Social Security, unemployment assistance, and various other desired collective goods. That ordering has been turned upside down by the social outlook of today, and the shifting emphasis has caused government to undertake the activist role formerly assumed by the market. One may be permitted to wonder whether there is not some profound confusion in a society that strives so hard to retain a peacetime economy through 7 long years of war, and then leaps into a wartime economy almost the moment peace breaks out. More fundamentally, something must be wrong in a society that feels compelled to treat each new problem, no matter how routine, as a monumental crisis, and hence chooses to live in a continual atmosphere of tension, sacrifice, and fear. As a friend of mine has put it, if the price system is not to be trusted with adjusting a 20% gap between supply and demand of energy, perhaps it had better hang up its spikes. But I'm here today to note the trend of affairs, not to pass judgment or to prophesy the ultimate outcome. Who can see what will come in the next 2 centuries any more clearly than our forefathers could envisage what vast change lay ahead in the 2 just completed? In a way, the starting point of the times is similar. Recall the traditional mercantilist controls of central government rejected by our founders. The fixing of prices, wages, and interest rates, the outlawing of forestalling and engrossing, the regulating of the quality of goods, the licensing of labor, the setting of sumptuary standards, the granting of monopoly rights, the chartering of corporations, and the establishing of state enterprises. They have all found a congenial home in the New Deals, Fair Deals, New Frontiers, Great Societies, and New Federalisms of our age. Yet the very environment being created by them affords us something to react against in the same way that our forefathers did, perhaps once again to the benefit of liberty. As the saying goes, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. Let me end, then, on a soft note of hope in keeping with the occasion. The mood is unfortunately one of hope rather than expectation, for there is little in the momentum of unfolding history to comfort those who cherish freedom. What is there to prevent the fraction of income taxed by government from rising to half, 3/4, and more? there is a hope, and it is this. Having become so impressed with the fact that freedom is not everything or the only thing, perhaps we shall put that discovery behind us, and comprehend before it is too late that without freedom, all else is nothing. Thank you very much.
We have just heard a lecture by Dr. G. Warren Nutter on freedom in a revolutionary economy. Dr. Nutter expressed concern that government is undertaking too strong a role in our economic affairs, that many tasks preempted by government could be handled in the marketplace. Dr. Nutter's thesis is one of several varied looks at present-day America presented by the American Enterprise Institute as a part of its observance of the bicentennial of the United States. If you would like a copy of Dr. Nutter's lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute. That's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster, and thank you for joining us.